T.D. Jakes' succession. Inside the handoff of a 30,000-member empire, it happened in front of thousands of people, live, with no warning and no edit button. Bishop T.D. Jakes was deep into a Sunday sermon at the Potter's House in Dallas, the same pulpit he had preached from for nearly 3 decades, when he suddenly lowered his microphone and began to shake. Within seconds, church officials swarmed the stage. The live stream cut away. And for a few terrifying hours, nobody watching around the world knew whether one of the most influential pastors in modern American history was going to survive the night. This is the story of what happened next, how a health scare that nearly killed a 67-year-old bishop on live television became the catalyst for one of the most closely watched succession plans in megachurch history, and how that plan ended not with a single hand-picked heir, but with something far less common, a husband and wife team stepping into the pulpit together. Let's set the scene properly, because the details matter here. On November 23, 2024, during a Sunday service at the Potter's House, Jakes was finishing an hour-long sermon when the adrenaline of preaching wore off and his body could no longer hide what was actually happening inside it. He later described the moment in vivid detail during an interview on the Today Show, explaining that he felt no typical warning signs, no chest pain, no numbness, nothing that would have told him something was catastrophically wrong. He simply felt himself drifting off, and the next thing he knew, he was in an ambulance, with a doctor leaning over him to deliver the news. He had suffered a massive heart attack. The right side of his heart had completely stopped receiving blood, blocked by a clot, and doctors later told him that if he had arrived at the hospital just 5 minutes later, he would not have survived. In the days immediately following the incident, the church described it publicly only as a slight health incident, a vague phrase that did little to calm the concern rippling across social media as the video of his collapse spread. It would take until March of 2025, 4 months later, for Jakes to reveal the full truth of what had happened to him that night, and by then, the conversation around his health had already quietly evolved into a much bigger conversation about the future of his church. Because here's the thing about a health scare like that, especially one that happens in full public view, it forces a question that most founders of massive organizations try to avoid answering for as long as possible. What happens when the person who built the institution is no longer able to run it? For Jakes, that question was not new. The Potter's House was not some small congregation. Since he founded it in 1996, it had grown into a non-denominational megachurch with more than 30,000 members, campuses spread across Dallas, Fort Worth, and Denver, and a media and business footprint that extended into television, publishing, and film. Jakes had spoken at a presidential inauguration. He had built an empire, not just a church. And empires without succession plans have a well-documented tendency to collapse the moment their founder can no longer hold them together. Jakes seemed to understand exactly how high the stakes were. In comments he made afterward, he explained his thinking with a line that cuts right to the heart of the matter. He said he could not afford, especially after what happened in November, to risk something happening to him and leave his congregation, in his words, as sheep without a shepherd. Here's what most casual observers didn't realize at the time, though. This succession plan was not some hurried, panicked reaction dreamed up in the weeks after his hospital stay. It had actually been years in motion already. Back in 2022, Jakes' daughter, Sarah Jakes Roberts, and her husband, Touré Roberts, relocated to Dallas specifically to begin stepping into deeper leadership roles within the church. By July of 2023, the two of them were formally installed as assistant pastors at the Potter's House, the first time in the church's 27-year history that anyone had held that position. That detail matters enormously because it means that when the public announcement finally came in the spring of 2025, it was not the beginning of a transition plan, it was closer to the final chapter of one. Jakes had spent roughly 3 years deliberately building his daughter and son-in-law's visibility, credibility, and hands-on experience inside the exact institution he was preparing to hand to them. The formal announcement came on April 27, 2025, in a Sunday service filled with the kind of raw emotional weight you rarely see from someone who has spent nearly 50 years as a public figure. Jakes, choking back tears at points, spent roughly 30 minutes walking his congregation through the full arc of the decision, explaining not just the mechanics of the transition, but the spiritual and personal reasoning behind it. He framed the moment as something bigger than one church changing pastors. In his own words, he described it as entering his 50th year in the public spotlight and recognizing an urgent need to turn his attention toward larger structural challenges facing his community: a shrinking middle class, social unrest, and the widening gap in economic opportunity. His plan, he said, was to use this next chapter of his life to work as a bridge between community organizations, cultural institutions, and corporate partners, essentially stepping out of the day-to-day pulpit responsibilities so he could operate on a bigger stage focused on economic empowerment. He was careful to frame the moment not as a retirement or a departure, but as what he called a rebirth. Then came the installation itself, and this is where the ceremony took on real symbolic weight. On July 6, 2025, exactly on the Potter's House's 29th anniversary, Bishop Jakes formally installed Sarah Jakes Roberts and Touré Roberts as co-senior pastors during a service that stretched nearly 4 hours inside the church's massive 8,000-seat sanctuary. The building was packed. Elders, deacons, and ministers from across the congregation's leadership filled the room alongside thousands of regular members and an enormous online viewership tracking the moment as it happened. Dr. Cindy Trim delivered the sermon for the occasion, titled, fittingly, The Last Sermon, Leadership Redefined, using the platform to praise Jakes' legacy while also honoring his wife Sarita, whom she described as the steady backbone behind decades of his ministry. At the emotional center of the service, Sarah and Touré were anointed with oil and blessed directly by Bishop Jakes and Sarita, a moment captured on video and shared across the church's social media with a caption that read, in part, that a mantle had been passed with power and a future had been set in motion. Now, here's where this story becomes genuinely interesting from a leadership and institutional strategy perspective, not just a religious one. Most megachurch successions that make headlines follow a familiar pattern. An aging founder handpicks a single successor, typically a son, and that successor takes over as the new solitary face of the ministry. What Jakes did instead was structurally different. He installed two people together as equal co-senior pastors, a husband and wife team sharing the exact same title and authority rather than one spouse formally leading with the other in a supporting role. That is not a small distinction. It suggests a deliberate move away from the singular, personality-driven model that so many megachurches have historically been built around. A model where the entire identity and stability of the institution rests on one person's charisma, health, and public presence. By splitting senior leadership between two people with genuinely different strengths, Sarah as a New York Times best-selling author and the founder of the Woman Evolve movement, and Touré as an entrepreneur and the founder of his own church community called One, Jakes appears to be betting on a more distributed structure, one that in theory is more resilient precisely because it does not depend entirely on any single individual's continued health, availability, or personal brand. That shift shows up in more than just the org chart, too. Sarah and Touré bring a communication style that is noticeably different from the one that built the Potter's house in the first place. Jakes made his name as a spellbinding, old-school orator, someone whose sermons became instantly quotable cultural moments. Most famously, his Woman, Thou Art Loosed ministry, that turned into books, conferences, and eventually films. His daughter and son-in-law operate in a different register entirely. Sarah Jakes Roberts has built a massive following through the Woman Evolve platform, one defined by openness about her own personal struggles, her teenage pregnancy, her divorce, her mental health, communicated in a tone that feels less like a polished sermon and more like a conversation with a close friend. Touré Roberts, meanwhile, built one church with a deliberately modern, accessible aesthetic aimed at reaching people who might feel alienated by traditional church culture altogether. Together, their public voice leans digital first and emotionally transparent, a style clearly built to resonate with a younger generation of believers who came of age on social media rather than in a pew, and who often respond more to vulnerability than to polish. Bishop Jakes has not disappeared from the picture, though, and it is worth being precise about what he actually stepped back from versus what he kept. He is no longer the primary preaching pastor handling the daily demands of pulpit ministry at the Potter's house, but he remains chairman of the church's board and continues to serve as its spiritual overseer, meaning he still holds real institutional authority and continues providing vision and counsel behind the scenes. Beyond the church itself, he has redoubled his focus on the TD Jakes Group, the broader business and media operation that includes the TD Jakes Foundation, positioning himself for a next chapter built around economic empowerment initiatives rather than weekly sermons. In other words, this was never really a retirement. It was a reallocation, freeing him from the grinding weekly demands of pastoral leadership so he could redirect his remaining energy toward the wider empire he has spent decades building around the church itself. Reactions to the transition have been genuinely split, and both sides of that split are worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Supporters, and there are many, point to this as a genuine model of healthy, intentional succession planning, something megachurch culture has historically struggled with, rather than waiting for a crisis to force an unprepared handoff. Jake spent years deliberately building his successor's credibility inside the institution itself, giving the congregation years to grow comfortable with Sarah and Touré's leadership before the formal transition ever happened. Fans of the move argue this gives the Potter's house a genuine chance to survive and even thrive beyond its founder, something that has notoriously not happened at other prominent ministries when a charismatic leader either passed away or stepped down without adequate preparation. But the critique is just as loud, and it deserves to be represented fairly here too. A meaningful portion of observers, including some within the broader Christian community, have raised real concerns about the optics of installing your own daughter and son-in-law into the most powerful position within a 30,000-member institution. One frequently echoed comment on social media following the installation put the skepticism bluntly, arguing that spiritual leadership should be built on being called or anointed rather than inherited, and questioning whether the whole arrangement risks making the ministry look more like a family business than a house of worship. Theologians who have weighed in on the broader trend of family succession within megachurch culture have voiced similar caution, warning that ministry leadership is not supposed to function like a monarchy, and that a founder's child inheriting a pulpit only makes sense if that child demonstrates clear spiritual calling and leadership capability independent of their last name. Since assuming otherwise risks discouraging genuinely gifted leaders elsewhere in the congregation who will never share that bloodline. It's also worth noting, in fairness to the broader conversation, that family succession in megachurch culture has an uneven track record. Some hereditary handoffs at other prominent ministries have led to real decline or even collapse, while others have continued to thrive, and this history is exactly why so many are watching Dallas closely to see which outcome the Potter's House will produce. So, where does that leave the Potter's House right now? The institution Bishop Jakes built is enormous by almost any measure. 30,000 members, multiple campuses, decades of cultural influence. A media and business apparatus that extends far beyond a single Sunday service. The real test of this succession was never going to be the ceremony itself, no matter how emotional or well-produced it was. The real test is what comes over the next several years, as Sarah Jakes Roberts and Touré Roberts try to hold on to the size and cultural relevance of an institution built almost entirely around one man's singular presence and charisma, while simultaneously proving that a more collaborative, distributed, emotionally transparent style of leadership can sustain that same scale for a new generation of believers. Bishop Jakes handed them something rare, a running start, years of prepared groundwork, and his own continued presence as chairman and spiritual overseer standing behind them. What they do with that head start, whether they expand the church's influence into new cultural territory, or whether the institution slowly contracts without its founder's singular gravitational pull, is a story that is still being written in real time. If this is a story you want to keep following, subscribe, because we will be tracking exactly how this new leadership era at the Potter's House unfolds. Let us know in the comments whether you see this succession as a model other institutions should copy, or whether you share the skepticism many have voiced about keeping that much influence within one family. Either way, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.